Good evening, all. I have, for the last 13 years of my life, been privileged to bring the life, values, ups and downs, successes and failures of Benjamin Franklin to audiences all over the country and abroad in costume and in character. My background is as an actor of over 60 years and a teacher for over 50. And I bring these two parts of my life together to study and to present Ben to audiences. I am more used to and more comfortable with presenting in the first person. But I would like to talk to you this evening in the third person about Ben Franklin as the perfect example of 18th century energy. In fact, I would call Ben the Energizer Bunny of his time. I want to specifically talk this evening about incidents from his youth and his apprenticeship as a printer, about his work in Philadelphia for the benefit of his city, about his own scientific experimentations, his inventions, and his diplomacy, which lasted about 40 years of his life, all of which, to me, are examples of Ben, the Energizer Bunny of his time. Ben Franklin was born in Boston in 1706, and his father had intended him to go into the ministry. He was the 10th son of his father, Josiah. And it was common for the 10th son to be tithed to the church. Tithe, 10, same thing. And so he was packed off, young Ben, to the Boston Latin School at the age of 8, with the idea being that he would study there for 6, 7 years and then go into Harvard College and become a minister. But Ben's own personal energy, his own excitement about life and inability to sit still put paid to that idea fairly quickly. At table, Ben was hardly able to contain himself and sit still through what he considered his father's interminable graces. And one day, after a year or so at the Boston Latin School, his father and he went down to the basement, the cellar of their house on Milk Street in Boston, to the great chest where their winter's provisions were kept, the salted cod and the meats and so forth. Ben was about 9 at the time. They opened the great crate to get some salted cod or whatever out of it for dinner, and Ben looked and said, "I think, Father, that if you said grace over the whole lot right now, it'd be a great savings of time." Well, you are laughing, and I too join you, but I don't think his father Josiah was laughing very much at all. He began to think that Ben was too saucy a lad to make a good preacher, and I think he was right. So they had to do something with him, and they decided on something good. After he took Ben out of the Boston Latin School, Ben felt uneducated, stupid, inferior, uncomfortable, and had the same kind of insatiable desire to know and to learn as Dr. Hallenbeck has shown he has to you tonight. And so Ben could read, and he read everything he could get his hands on. And they decided to apprentice him to his older half-brother James, who had a print shop in Boston. Excellent choice for someone who loved to read. And that would have gone fine for 10 years or so, and Ben would have turned out to be a printer and live in Boston and live happily ever after, except for the fact that his older half-brother James, who was 10 years his elder, beat him. And when he was 14 and 15 years old, and James was 25 or so, and James was a strong young man, he beat him whenever it took his fancy to do so. And Ben developed enough energy and resentment and hatred of power arbitrarily applied unethically that he organized his own flight from Boston at the age of 17. He ran away, leaving Boston, his home, his parents, his siblings, his employment. He was breaking a contract of his apprenticeship. And he ran and made his way to New York looking for work. Couldn't find any. Continued all the way with the energy of youth, crossed the colony of New Jersey, and ended up on the wharf of Philadelphia at the age of 17 with virtually nothing but gumption. And he had the energy to make good on that and find his way, become an apprentice printer in Philadelphia. He was so successful there as a youth at 18 that the governor of the colony of Pennsylvania, Governor Keith, discovered him and sent him on a mission to England to bring back modern printing equipment for the colony of Pennsylvania. And when he was there, he found that all the letters of credit that the governor had promised him and letters of introduction weren't on the ship at all. And so again, he had to make his way. And again, his own personal energy was responsible for that. Now, we don't picture Ben Franklin as a young 18-year-old adolescent, strong and physically tough, but he was. And he, among other things, when he was in London at that time, was showing off one day to his friends by swimming 3 miles down the Thames River. 3 miles. Now that's energy in action, if you would agree. And along the bank was a businessman who was watching this demonstration, and he followed Ben for a couple of miles. And when Ben came out of the water, he offered Ben the opportunity to stay in England and teach swimming on a full-time basis. Ben would have done it, but his passage back to America and Philadelphia had already been paid, and therefore he refused. I often wonder, what would America's beginnings and the Republic have been had Ben Franklin been out of the loop and stayed in England being a swim teacher? But he went back and eventually became his own businessman. And his energy was such, both physical and mental, that he was able to juggle 3 different areas of life at the same time. One was to run his own business, to run his own print shop. He married at 24, and his wife, Deborah, was helpful in the print shop. But basically, he ran that himself, and he put out the 2 most widely circulated publications in the colony, his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and the Poor Richard's Almanac that we all know. That was the bestseller for 25 years. But in addition to the energy that it took to run that, and by the way, he wanted to impress potential clients for him, so he would often himself take a wheelbarrow and go all the way down to the wharf and get great rolls of paper for his paper mill, and himself, the boss of the operation, carry that wheelbarrow full of rolls of paper or hemp paper that he was using for his print business up the noisy cobblestones so that everybody would know how industrious a young man he was. He was good at promotion. But in that business world, he was also interested and committed to making the world a better place, not just himself. He had read a book where it said that the best life you can have is one of service. And the best way to serve God was doing good to man. He absorbed that, and he believed it. And he was the one who formed a group of young businessmen in Philadelphia, the very first professional association. And together they were responsible for creating the first public library in Philadelphia, the first hospital in Philadelphia. It's still there. A revitalized fire brigade and police constabulary. First time it was a real fighting force. Ben was in charge also of starting a new college, a new learning center in Philadelphia called the College of Philadelphia, which we know today as the University of Pennsylvania. But that's not all he did. His energy was such, and his scientific interests so vast, that he became interested in the study of biology, of physics, invented the science of meteorology, invented all kinds of machines and gadgets and things for the benefit of mankind, never taking a shilling for any of them because he thought that it was unethical. He was doing all this at the same time. So it was not surprising that with all of this work and all of this interest, he became interested in such matters as the common cold. And he believed something that was radical. He believed that the common cold was not spread by exposure to cold air, but rather to some tiny little bug in the air, because he noticed that people who worked inside got colds more often than people who worked outside in the winter. And ever since that time, he started each day the same way, with a series of deep breathing exercises in front of a wide open window in the nude. He was aware that practice was a little disturbing to some of his neighbors across the street. He paid no attention to it at all. His inventions included, of course, the lightning rod, which we all know about. But what we may not all know about is that the lightning rod and the kite experiment and all that was almost an afterthought. His idea was to put a 20-foot iron rod on the tallest building in Philadelphia, run a wire far away from that lightning rod so that the electrical energy that hit the rod would be dissipated and taken away and grounded into the wire leading from the iron stake. But the tallest building in Philadelphia was Christ Church bell tower, and work on it had slowed. Ben was impatient to begin. He remembered his enjoyment as a youth flying kites, and the rest is history. When he moved his knuckle, I think of Cat being zapped by lightning. When Ben moved his knuckle just close enough to that key to feel that there was electrical energy from the sky that had struck the tip of the kite, the little metal tip, and moved all the way down the 75 feet of hemp string to also charge that key, he knew that the lightning rod was going to be successful, and it was. It was also very good for the colony, too, because heretofore people had not given much credence to American colonial ingenuity. And Ben was given the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for his work in science. His work was known almost immediately all through Europe, and the colonial Americans benefited from Ben's work. It's not surprising that with all that, he was chosen to represent us in England as a diplomat. And he did. And he spent almost 5 years there first to try to mediate between an increasingly arrogant parliament and the point of view of the colonials, but to no avail. To get him out of town, they made him postmaster general, sent him back to Philadelphia. And so again, on the high seas, another 6 weeks crossing on the high seas, and he ran the postal service for a year and a half, having the energy to take an 8-month trip around all the colonies in order to understand his countrymen better so that he might represent them better. This was energy. I must tell you that I'm very delighted to tell you that during Ben Franklin's term as Postmaster General, it was the only time in the history of the U.S. Post Office that it ran in the black. Ben went back to England. He wasn't through. 10 more years of diplomacy, patience, and mental energy expended on trying to bring the sides together were to no avail. And so at the age of 70, when he wanted to retire, he returned to Philadelphia and instead worked with Thomas Jefferson on editing the Declaration of Independence, after which, instead of being permitted to retire to that little farm in the Ohio Valley he coveted, he went back to Europe, this time as our nation's first ambassador to Paris, to try to get the French to help support this new nation for commercial advantages down the line. He loved living in Paris. He enjoyed everything about it, but his work was serious, and the energy that he expended in the afternoons and evenings in the salons of Paris to get the French on our side was enormous. Well, his work wasn't done. Even after writing the important paragraphs in the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War, there was still more work to do. That was in 1783. He didn't leave Paris for another year and a half. When Thomas Jefferson came over to take the command, Ben was able to return, and once again, at the age of 79, headed across the Atlantic. To give you an idea of his scientific interest and how it was lifelong, I cite that last voyage home, where even at 79, on a tossing ship in the middle of the Atlantic, held on by his grandson, Temple Franklin, lest he fall over the gunwales into the Atlantic, Ben took temperature readings of the waters 7 times a day, 7 days a week, in order to try to determine whether temperature differential could be important in measuring the breadth of the Gulf Stream. That was Benjamin Franklin. But it wasn't over yet. We needed a government. And Franklin, at the age of 81, became our oldest delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, our elder statesman. And he didn't hold back with his views either. And some were approved and some were not. And after the Constitutional Convention was over, and we had our republic, great victory for Ben, his work was still not over. And he put further energy in his last days, in the last months of his life. In 1790, he got up with his gouty feet in front of our new Congress and argued for the acceptance of his plan to abolish slavery, to abolish the slave trade, to integrate freed slaves into full American life. That was his last act at 84 before his death. And so, my friends, tonight, I present to you Benjamin Franklin as an example of the Energizer Bunny of the 18th century. Thank you.